Great. Welcome, everyone. So this is our second session talking about medication statement. We are covering some of the same material we covered in the first session, but hopefully moving on into further discussions after that. Feel free to weigh in with questions or via chat if you have any queries along the way. But hopefully, we can crack on through this material. So this should set us up, hopefully, to have discussions in the TDG meetings to talk about profiles and usage of this particular resource type. All right, so I might move along. So it's going. First, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather today, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you. So today we're doing an information session. So this is pretty informal, so please do weigh in. And we are, having a look at particularly the medication statement resource and how it relates to some of the other resources we're interested in. We are not going to particularly talk about dosage detail at this point. There'll be some future work on that. There's some information sessions coming on that topic, and that will be handled separately, although it is part of a medication statement. We may talk about implementation topics and other things related, and we definitely will be talking about AECDI and how that those set of requirements is feeding into this our usage in AU Core. Okay. So basically, we're going to cover some info. So we're going to cover the basic FHIR R4 content. Going to look at different uses of medication statement to sort of give it a context, and then also into the proposal itself and how that may pan out at the meeting. I think that's still sort of being prepared for our next TDG call, but this will set the background for that. So to kick us off, we have a Menti to have a go at. So if you can use the QR code or go to menti.com and use the code supplied. We have a few polls along the way so we can get some handle on who and what's happening here. Show us what's happening.
I assume people can see my screen?
Yes, we can. $36 online, a few AIs. So I think we've got 20. So we have plenty of software developers here, standards development, health informaticians, architects, information modelers. So I think that's pretty good. Any last votes? Yep. All right, moving on. Just to get a picture of where you are with the standards and standards usage. So fire starter means I'm just getting started. A light, I've done some. Catching fire means you're kind of in progress, and blazing means you're probably already implementing something adjacent to this already.
How do we answer these polls?
You want to go to Menti at the top there, you can see menti.com. If you go to that, there's a code 87589372, and that will get you into the poll.
Take that into the code and it says it's not working. Does that happen to anyone else, or just me?
Check the code.
Menti?
I didn't
There's
use
a
the
QR.
code. I just used the QR code.
I've just popped a fresh QR code up on the screen, so you can see if that one works.
Thank you.
Thanks, that works. The code didn't on the website. Thank you.
Oh, cool. All right. So you can see there we've got quite a few people either blazing or catching fire, and a few getting started. So looks really good. That's great. I think that gives us a picture. So I'm going to go to here. Is she going? Cool. So thanks for that. And so I'm just going to go on, and now I did cover this last time. So if you're here last time, I'm going to move a bit quicker through this stuff today to try and get on to the other material. So this is just a bit of an overview of the different resource types that are kind of medication related in the FHIR specification. So there's the medication resource itself, which is really about recording details of a medication. So it's not particularly a particular use, it's really essentially the identification of a medication, and that's usually the code and forms and things like that about the medication. So when you want to kind of describe that fully, medication resources is a good way to do that. We have the three kind of workflow resources: medication request, medication dispense, and medication administration, which are kind of workflow-based events that happen around medication usage. So medication request is things for like orders and prescribing, dispense when a supply is made, so that includes pharmacy, and administration when things are administered to patients, so that maybe in hospitals, residential aged care, and things where things are administered directly. And records of those. So that they're things that are kind of recorded along the way as medications kind of business is applied. And then we have immunization out to the side, which is a different kind of medication. So that's particularly carved out as a specific resource type. So immunization records vaccines and immunization activity particularly. So that's a different thing than medications as such, and that there's a distinction made in the FHIR specification around that. And what we're talking about mainly today is the medication statement. So you can see medication statement is not really reflecting any particular part of the medication workflow. It's not a prescription dispense or administration record. It is essentially a record stating that a patient is expected to be using a particular medication, and that can come from various sources. It may be a entered curated record of medication usage that somebody enters into the system. That may be the clinician recording what they do, but also maybe as a current med in someone's current meds list, or it may be reported by the patient that they're using particular medications, or it may come from somewhere else. Like you may get a report that another clinician is prescribing something for a patient, and you may want to record that in your system. So it's a way to kind of record expectations about a current medication use for a patient, and having a way to kind of independently capture that, independent of the actual workflow recording itself. So what it does is really give you a set of things where you can now have some belief that the patient is taking a particular medication, and use that as part of your providing care. It is probably notable that the workflow resources, request, dispense, and administration, imply that the patient may well be taking this medication. So often things like requests are used as a mechanism to drive the creation of medication statements, or be presented as medication statements. So because there's some belief that the patient is actually taking the thing that is prescribed. But again, that's mainly left up to systems to decide on how to interpret their workflows and business. But these are essentially resource types to hang that information off. So that's probably good for that. Any questions on that stuff? I hear nothing, but please do jump in if you think of anything. Cool. So just to kind of put that in context, I've got a diagram that kind of tries to show some of the aspects of this. So probably start in the middle. There's this kind of request event workflow thing happening in the middle, where often you'll have requests that medication requests that authorize dispensing and administration of medications. So there's some kind of relationship there where you expect those prescriptions or orders will be kind of executed in some way. But there's a record of the prescription itself. You have records of dispensing. So when meds are supplied in various ways. So that may be in internal workflows in hospitals, or in community kind of pharmacy scenarios and things like that. Dispense records are kept. So there's medication dispense to support that. And when you do actually supply directly, administer medications for a patient, that can be recorded. So typically there may be something like a nursing administration record, and things usually more inpatient or residential based care, but yeah, maybe in any context really. So that's kind of capturing medications workflow. Now I've got immunization there as well as another type of administration. But we won't talk a lot about that. And then you'll see those workflow events all refer to medication as a definition or identification piece. So one way to describe the medication of interest is to have a full medication resource definition, which describes the medication content, so the drug type, the maybe forms, maybe ingredients for compounded things, and so forth. So medication is a way to do that. That's not strictly necessary. If you have particularly coded medications, you can just use a code to describe what is being administered or dispensed or requested. But that is an option to use a full medication resource. And so on the side, we have medication statement. So there's this kind of relationship set up where those workflow and recordings kind of imply that the medication is in use. And so that may lead you to creating a medication statement. You can also directly create medication statements through reports or assertions by someone. So some information source, that may be the patient, maybe a clinician. So there is a way to sort of create them directly as well. So that's kind of just reiterating the resource types again. So does anything there require any further info? Don't hear anything. That's good. Just jump in if you feel free. Feel free. Oh, I've got another Menti. So I think this one we are going on to find out a little bit more about what people are actually doing. It's important. Okay, so what use cases involving medications information are important to you? So this is just a free form thing. Where we see our core use cases, prescribing, dispensing, and we can see some more medications management stuff with reconciliations and current meds. What else have we got? Discharge. So yeah, kind of transfers. So discharges. Yeah, there's a bit of like meds management stuff. So pre-hospital visits. Great. Medicines review again, kind of reviews and reconciliation. Great. That's a pretty good picture. Thanks for your comments there. Great. And just a query on if you have implemented any of these resource types already, and probably if you have intent, serious intent, like you have a plan to do so, be probably interested in that. So we see there is some implementation medication request on top, which is somewhat expected. That's been in our AU Core R1 profile. And medication statement has some good support, and yeah, dispensing and administration, I think, are more setting oriented kind of entities. We don't have any AU Core definitions yet for those, but I think they may well be relevant for some of the other use cases that will come along. All right, so it's a good picture. Thank you. Let me get back. Great. So, medication statement. So I've lifted some summary out of the FHIR the FHIR specification itself. I tried to lift out the bits that are particularly good in describing what makes this distinct from the other types of resources. So really, it's good for when patients are reporting medication use. So that's one of the cases where it's not actually sort of kind of directly in a prescribing dispensing workflow. So it's a reported use, and you know, as well as patients that may be kind of from other clinicians sort of prescribed elsewhere kind of information, where things are getting reported to a clinician. They want to take a record of that. And also that, you know, typically there's derived from kind of concepts where through the regular medications workflow, that's driving the creation of or being derived from those workflow events. So whether that's prescribing, dispensing, or administration, that's indicating that a patient, you know, is expected to be using that medication. You may have more or less confidence in that, and that's essentially left up to the systems to decide whether they want to assert a medication statement based on any of that activity. I'm pretty sure if you administered something, you'd be pretty sure that the patient is taking it, but you may be less sure if you've prescribed it and don't know about its actual use for sure. And dispensing might be somewhere in between where you know they have a supply, but you don't know whether they're taking it. So yeah, so notably down the bottom there, it's a statement is not part of the typical workflow sequences of prescribe, dispense, administer, but it is a report or a derived report that the medication use has happened and leads you to believe the patient is receiving a particular medication. So that's probably just some context on what medication statement resource thinks it is. Cool. So just to give some examples and kind of show some distinction with some of the other workflow things, a clinician may prescribe something, so that may end up being a script. So say in a GP case, it may end up being a script. That will probably create a medication request record. It is a request or an order itself, and you may decide to generate a medication statement based on that. So that's essentially a derived case where you think prescribing means that the patient would be expected to take that medication, so you want to include that in their current meds list as a medication statement. We might have a case where patient reports they are taking some over-the-counter kind of medicines or supplements or other. So St. John's ward, it's a great example because it has all the interactions in the world. And so that's something you may well want to record in your system to help with your things like decision support, triggering and things like that. So effectively, that's not a prescription or as such. So one way to do that is to create a medication statement directly and record that usage, in your system as one of the current medications the patient is on. You may also get informed from another clinician, like a psychiatrist, who's prescribed something for the patient as part of their care, and you would want to record that fact, and also again that feeds into having a full kind of medications usage record. And the ability to use that for things like decision support and other kinds of information, summaries and so forth. So again, that's a way a reported usage may end up being a medication statement. And some of the other kinds of use, so we talked about kind of using things. Medication statement also supports where some other kind of aspects of medication use. So a patient may do something like refuse to take something due to a problem. So they say, I can't take these tablets, I can't swallow them easily. So whilst they've been prescribed these things, they may be unable or unwilling to take something. So medication statement can actually record that kind of not taken status. So that gives you an assertion that the patient is not taking something, and maybe a reason why. So that may be a useful medication context to have when looking at that patient. So you can see they have problems with particular forms or other particular issues, and so that gives you a good medication history entry. So that's a different kind of usage. You can also have clinician stopped kind of things where the patient has extreme side effects or something like that, where it's not necessarily it's basically just an action taken by the clinician due to deciding to either change meds due to side effects or just stop something, and there is a way to record that in the system as a medication statement. So again, this is not the fact that the patient is taking something. This is the fact that the patient is not going to take something, and perhaps reasons for that, which is super useful in treatment, because obviously you don't want to keep re-prescribing something that is causing a problem for the patient. So that is really nice to share if there's in a record transfer, to be able to inform other people of that particular action. We have also things like intentions. So it's possible for say pre-op intention for a patient to take something. So you may actually want to indicate some kind of plan to do something based on a future event or something like that. So medication statements can certainly kind of cover some of those things as well, where you can say, I expect the patient may take this in the future, or is likely to take this in the future, which gives you more information again if you're seeing the patient at a particular point in time. So that's kind of trying to cover the things, the things we kind of have to cover. So just from a full resource perspective, this is the data model for the medication statement. So you can see it's got a pretty substantial set of things. Probably the highlights are the things like status, which are required, which kind of gives you those active, stopped, intended, not taken kind of states that the statement may be in. There's some interpretation there in systems, and you have to kind of think about what you want to state. Key content like the medication itself. So that can be a code or a reference to a medication resource issue. There's a reference to a patient, which you kind of expect. This is a record about a patient. There's things like context of if it's in a particular encounter, effective date time, which kind of tells you when this statement is relevant. So it may start at a particular point in time or end at a particular point in time. So we have date times and periods to describe that, and reasons for medication and things like that. So so there's some set of things that are possible that we probably may or may not include in an AU core profile. But that's kind of to give you an overview of what that's about. So just looking onto AUCDI. So AUCDI has a medication use statement, which is mappable to medication statement. So in particular, there's a set of the details there that AUCDI has picked out. So just to kind of land those in where they may live in a medication statement resource, we have the medication name, which is essentially our medication code or medication resource that describes the medication. Medication statements that medication resource may exist independently, so that has codes and other information about the medication. We have indications, so that's really the reasons. So we have reason code and reason reference to describe the reason you may be taking the medication. We have a set of things like strength. That's essentially an attribute of the medication itself. So sort of lives in the code or the medication resource definition. So strength and form are pretty much identifying what medication you are taking. So live more in the medication in detail. We have a set of things which are dosage, which we're really not going to talk about too much today, but we definitely have dosage amount, the route, the timing, and we were having some follow-up sessions on dosage and being able to talk about those in more detail in future sessions. There's a comment which is essentially a medication statement, is a note that's attached to the medication usage. So it lets you describe things in free text kind of way if you want to. And the idea of a date of assertion, when asserting when this statement is relevant, when it has become asserted. So if you need to know when this assertion is true. So when we're talking about profiling, we have these are pretty much the approaches we take to all profiling in AU Core. So really trying to hit the minimum requirements needed to exchange a statement, is suitable for use across all or most use cases. So it's possible to be used in a lot of ways. We really set the minimum data expectations. So this is really kind of what do we really need to have a successful interoperable transfer of this information. So a methodology so that we can essentially retrieve this information and search for it effectively. So having that at least level of that capability described. There is a principles for inclusion for AU Core. I invite you to click on that to go and check what they are, but this is aligned with those. And the idea is here, we're going to be as light as we can be, and essentially this is really targeting the things that everyone can agree on readily as being available and supportable, and kind of move ahead into a usable profile, and then we can probably talk more about the grey areas as we go forward. But the idea is here that we're trying to hit something that works for everyone, and we get a result of it actually being implemented. So we will be flagging some of the elements with the must support flag, which means we are highlighting which key elements are the ones we care about, and also the obligations attached to that. The obligations are going to be similar to the obligations that we've applied to other profiles in AU Core. So you won't expect anything too special with this profile either. Cool. So I have a little bit on medication structure. I might just gloss over this slide. There's really two ways medications can be represented. One is codable. So Australian medicines terminology is a great example of a medicines terminology that can be used for that purpose. So that's really great if you want to refer to a pack or a unit of use as a code, and that's a really easy way to include which medication you're talking about. And it is possible to define a full medication resource where if you can't describe things easily with a code, you may be able to develop a medication resource that describes the type of information, the type of medication that is needed to be described. So it's just there's a flexible approach to that in terms of how we do that. We kind of expect most things will have a code that you can use and do things with. In some settings like hospitals and compounding situations, you're going to have probably more complicated medication concepts, but certainly the medication resource can handle those. Yeah, so that's probably worthwhile. When you do have a medication resource in use, it's probably worth noting that isn't necessarily like a drug database. That's maybe a denormalized kind of medication record that's collected along the way as part of prescribing or dispensing and administering, and effectively it's a way to describe the medication in a particular instance. So that kind of leads you to say this may be there may be a medication resource for each instance. You may want to use some of the FHIR contained concepts of actually containing it within a parent resource type, but that's probably more of an implementation concern, and we'll probably talk a bit more about that at connectathons and things like that. So the approach we've taken in terms of the AU Core profile, there's a selection of the elements that we are considering to be the ones that are likely to be required. So I guess, so from the larger medication statement available elements, these are the elements that have been indicated we kind of want to include with must support and obligations attached to them. You can see we want to apply Australian terminologies like PBS and AMT as our preferred kind of capability, and and we've included a set of things that we think are the most relevant for safe and kind of minimal exchange. So effectively status is required. We expect that. The medication, relevant medication detail, that seems pretty important for a medication statement. The patient that's relevant for, that's probably necessary as well. Then we have things like effective date, time or period, where you can indicate the usage period. So maybe starting at a date or definitely happened on a date or a period that it was in use. Reasons concept, so the having the reason why you're taking this medication, so that may be an indication or other reason for taking the medication, and then dosage information, which we assume is important, but we only have something here at the top level saying we want you to include that, but we don't as yet have the discussion completed on exactly what aspects of dosage AUCORE will indicate are important. So that is to follow in future discussions, but this kind of gives you the overview picture of the things we're interested in. So I've cracked through that. So I was just going to see if anyone had any particular comments on this proposal. Yeah, this is kind of where we are at the moment. There's still some discussion about a few elements that may be presented, and we are seeking feedback on this material. Yeah.
Also, alternatively, if people have questions that they want to go into more of the detailed elements about why, what does that look like, or a potential use case, or how this might actually surface in the system, or what the resource would look like if we're doing some of the use cases that were talked about, we can use this time to go through those.
Yes, yeah. And see if there's anything surprising here, or you think there's anything missing that is really super important. Great.
Thank you. I was just going to ask, is there capability to have a reference link or link to a reference source within this? And I'm just thinking back about end of life care, to some of the medications and some of the work we're doing nationally now, having best practice reference guides and stuff. Is that something that would be part of this, or is that different?
So is that more like clinical guidelines and monographs?
Yeah,
and
that's what I'm
yeah.
thinking. Yeah, if that capability is part of this, because you've got reason, reference, and I see.
Yeah.
And it would be that sort of clinical guideline or resource.
Yeah,
Might not
it's
be the
certainly
right place though. I'm just.
Yeah, I think that's a good. Yeah, I don't think there's necessarily a direct way. Other than you certainly could have like findings that lead you.
Yeah.
Right. So it maybe the finding comes from the guideline, in terms of the indication, and things like that. So certainly like capturing indications is like where the reason code and perhaps reason reference live. But it's also, yeah.
The one thing I was going to say, for example, dosage, we recommend particular dosage reference ranges to guide clinicians when they're prescribing, particularly for patients in end of life, and we've developed national standards and guidelines. So it's nice for them to be able to reference that as they're looking, and just having that additional safety check. But again, it depends where it sits in the big scheme of things, You don't want to overload and fatigue people.
So Greg, is it patient specific, or is it more general, like at
No.
the medication level?
Yeah, it would be at the medication level. So for example, we've got a reference guide. If you've got someone who's got, and please forgive me for being craft about this, is someone who's receiving terminal care in a residential aged care facility or an environment where this would be used, then there's a guideline about this is this is the type of medication that is recommended, and this is the dosage range. And it then gives that checkpoint for the clinician. But it would be at that general level rather than at the granular level of the particular patient. And I guess it's just kicking around that idea more than anything else.
I think, yeah, I mean, FHIR has increasingly more support for kind of definitional and pathways description and but yeah, I think this is more at the end of that. So that process kind of happens, selections are made and actions are taken, and this is like a record more than
So there is a medication knowledge resource in R5 at least. So from the medication resource, which is referenced from here, there is then a medication knowledge, and I'm not an expert around that, but that's potentially where things like formularies it mentions and stuff like that. So, but this is a patient specific statement, you know, that they are on this and this dosage. And yes, that might be guided by some guidelines, but this is the specific thing that they're taking at this particular time.
Yeah, I think the answer is probably it's recorded. If you are recording that stuff, it's probably recorded elsewhere as kind of planning and that kind of thing. And yeah, whereas this is more like a direct medical record. Yeah, I think.
I just know
That's a good question.
into some of the IMR, the EMR processes where as you open up the patient's medication, we've put direct links to to their medication.
Yeah, that could definitely work anyway. Like with the coding and the dosage detail, you can certainly do like dynamic lookup of the relevant material. That's another, I've seen that done before, where it'll essentially assess against those kind of monographs and things as well. Yeah, I think that's probably a step much more sophisticated than than we're at. But but I think there is definitely FHIR content that kind of references some of those concepts, and like I think it would take some work on how you would use those, but we're probably not quite there yet in terms of what we're trying to do.
Fair enough. No,
cool, excellent. Thank you.
What about post-operative nausea and vomiting? If you've got like an order of medications that you would give them, like sort of like if you've got 1 and then 2 and then 3.
But that's more describing a particular regime for.
Yeah, but there might be 3 different drugs.
Like
prochlorperazine and then on benzotron, and then you might have like a preference. Where would you reflect that?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have particular answers on how you might do it. Because I think at the moment, like this is really aimed at like looking at which elements we expect people to implement, and I think there are a lot of questions, particularly, and we haven't talked about dosage yet either, which kind of has concepts like timing and conditional kind of concepts and things like that as well. And when you have multiple drugs in play, that's even probably more sophisticated. So it's I think that is a world of exploration in terms of how you might actually use things. But I think what we're trying to aim for is to have just at least something people can guarantee to have populated.
Was the case being talked about? I think you said so. It's like post-operative instructions on particular medications to use. Was that the case that was posed?
I guess it could be instructions. Could be like first line, second line, or something like that against each order. Maybe that's what it's doing.
Yeah, I think I was unsure if we were talking more in, I guess, the guideline space, or more in, I guess, maybe more an intent to like in after a specific patient has had the operation, to provide them with and to have them take the medications. So is it more about I guess the abstract case across the more in the guideline sense, or is it more around the particular care associated with a specific patient?
I think it would be like a little bit of both, because there might be like some kind of policy to say at our hospital, this is the, like the order, but then you may have that order different to according to the patient and what the tolerance levels are. Yeah, so I think it's just specifying that there's 3 different medications for the same conditions, but the order of them is first to this one, and then number 2, and then number 3.
Yeah, because that's sounding like almost getting into planning kind of activity, and they are instructions, I guess, as well.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think in that case, I reckon we wouldn't. I don't think medication statement would be the right resource for that one. I mean, looking at its kind of summary state there, I think we might be more back into some of the other resources.
Yeah, the only reason I was thinking about it is because I think we talked about it being something where you record something that's planned, and prior to the surgery, the surgeon might put that in the chart as planned. So then does that then become like, content of medication statement?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And as you go through different steps, I guess, in care provision, and I guess, so from the purposes, I guess, of AU Core, what we're trying to do is, if you had to send this to a different system at this point in time, which FHIR resource would you use and how would you do it? So I think and obviously clinical systems are going to handle this internally and have their own data, that I think depending on which stage of the care provision, it might actually come out in different resources, sort of back in when Brett was presenting that if it's this case, you would probably see it as a medication request, but if it's at that step in care provision, you might actually see it come out as a medication statement. That's really interesting. And I think what you're describing is probably one of those scenarios, depending on where we are with either the early kind of care planning and the description of sort of the intent versus when the patient actually like leaves the hospital.
Yeah.
It's more like how do you describe those more sophisticated protocols that you want to say should be applied. And that I think there's not a lot of direct this is how it should be done at the moment either, but there are probably resources that you could look at to implement, but again, obviously in the standardization space, you're really saying, can I get enough people to agree that's how it should be exchanged to mean something to the sender and receiver? So so I think though that's if that's something that's of interest, it'd be really interesting to get some material around that, and probably try and find out who's interested in that kind of exchange. Yeah. Cool. So
I guess where we get specialists that bring the patients to the private hospitals, they might have these protocols in their practice rooms, and then whatever private hospital the surgery is happening at might need to receive that. That's kind of where I see that.
Yeah, and I think that's a good. I think use cases like that, it's like it would be interesting to say what does need to be exchanged there, in a structured way to make it useful, and I think that's a good thing to apply.
Well, that's been pretty cool. We've had 2 kind of complex sort of scenarios where our kind of interoperability focus is it becomes kind of really different depending on where we are. Is there anything else that people who have joined us want to pose or talk through? Heath?
Happy to defer this, given we've got 8 minutes left. But I've been looking at status, and you know that this is one of my bugbears. Where are we going? Assuming that we're not going to go with the R5 concepts of adherence in this particular profile, the only status that and obviously the status is in this particular version of the medication statement is pretty much adherence. The one that I see as problematic being forward compatible is intended. The others are quite clearly mappable. So I guess I'll be suggesting that we probably reduce this list of statuses. I know we haven't done this in the past, just to remove intended, because I don't believe there is a clear mapping going forward into R5, R6. I had a chat with Graham in Adelaide, and he thought that we should be thinking a little bit forward thinking in this as well, and only specify a set of statuses that made sense in that perspective as well. So I'm just putting it out there. Happy to have some discussion, but I'm putting it out there that that's probably where my current thinking is. It's probably not as bad as that has previously been. But that's, given some analysis, I think the intended status is problematic.
I think that's, to a degree, there's a concern there that I mean, we're building an R4 and we don't build, we don't tend to go, I mean, it is quite interesting, obviously, with people who are building systems in a different version of FHIR who want to build AU Core. But AU Core is FHIR R4. And I think there's also looking at international patient access and international patient summary, both of which don't restrict status. That there's some concern there that we're stating that in order to be compliant to Australia, we've determined that if you've decided to use this one, you can't operate in Australia. And I think that's a pretty bold statement by removing that in core, which sits above all possible use cases in Australia. So I mean, admittedly, I'm not keen on restricting value sets in core that are bound as required rather than extensible. That's a different situation. But for a required one, I think that's actually pretty dangerous and limiting in terms of our operation and positioning. So
if I could just quick jump in though, I just want to clarify, because the way I read it was that a medication statement is the record, and this is the status of the record, not what's in the record, but the artifact itself. And and that's, yeah.
That's the R5 definition, David. So unfortunately, the R4 definition is actually more about adherence.
Given the scenario.
So the medication status concepts, and I'll just post it in the chat, and Brett, you could click on that and just bring that one up so that we could just, in the last few minutes, show people what the current one is. And yet a lot of these resources, and in fact, this resource isn't forwards compatible regardless of this issue. They've had some changes in R5 and there'll be more in later versions of FHIR. So Brett, are you able to click on the link in the chat? Oh, oops.
Can you see that?
I can only see your PowerPoint.
Oh, hang on. Let me...
links are working good.
And we can just put that up, and then he can kind of talk to, I guess, intended. And so these ones, as you can see here, about the medication. So active is how you actually signal that active medication. So a patient is taking the medication when you set the status as active, and completed is very similar to like the open air workflows there. So it's much more similar in this status to the open air model kind of state machine, which is describing really about medication usage at this time.
Yeah.
That, as Heath has pointed out in R5, they've actually decided, okay, yes, this is good information, but really because some of the other resources in FHIR have used the element status to describe what you were saying. It's actually about the record of the data, that we should support both concepts in FHIR. So they've actually created a new adherence element, and they've moved all the information about medication usage into there, and they've repurposed the status element to actually be about like record status,
yeah,
which is
it
much
feels
more
like an
similar to
episode,
others.
right? It feels like an episode of medication I'm getting.
Yeah.
Okay.
And while they've done that, they've also re-examined, do they want to keep all those values? How is that working? And they've reimagined some of these older values that have been hanging around for a while in FHIR, and they're not exact one-to-ones in the later versions of FHIR, which is, I guess, what Heath is saying, that his proposal is that if we can't have an exact one-to-one that is forward compatible, we shouldn't be including all of those. And I'm like, yeah, but I think we should deal with that when we get to the future ones. So I guess that's kind of our two positions.
Yeah, I
Having
think
said that, I
Yeah.
think that perhaps what we should be focusing on is because the concept of intended, I think, is still reasonable, and maybe we should actually be advocating for that to be added to R5 value sets rather than the reverse. So that's another way of thinking about it.
Yeah,
Because it
there's
really is
question
a
on
planned,
where to go. Yeah.
a planned medication is, I think, probably a reasonable state or adherence.
Cool. Yeah, I think we should address it, right? We should say how we would tackle it and where would you go if you have these records recorded as intended? What would happen if you went to R6 or something, right? Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, which I'm not.
Okay.
I mean, I'm kind of positing that we can move that conversation down the road while potentially trying to add this to the value set, that when we do actually move on to, which we've softly talked about, maybe doing FHIR R6 instead of 5, that gives us a longer pathway to kind of talk about if there is usage of intended and we've got these use cases, how do we carry that forwards? Because I do think there's value in those use cases.
Cool.
Yeah, that's good. Anyway, I think we've got one more minute. So I just gone to next steps. So there is a proposal that reflects what is presented here. That's getting kind of fully finalized for our TDG discussions. There is a feedback page where you can make comments about the current profile that is proposed for medication statements. So feel free to add things there. We will try and incorporate that feedback in our work directly. And there is an intent to take that to the 6th of March meeting for AU Core to actually propose the adoption of a profile and the capability statements for interactions around that, and move that forward into the spec proper, which will make it available for connectathons and into balloting as well. So yep. So all right, hopefully we can get that done. We'll have that in the March connectathon available for testing and playing with, and yeah, and we do have our regular Zulip chat channel where we can see information flow there. If you have questions or anything, that's a really great place to drop them as well, because people are watching. That's probably all the main things to cover. So I think that's all I have. Any final comments?
Great work. Thanks.
All right, great. Yeah, feel free to reach out if you have some questions, and yeah, we'll try and land this thing.
Thank you.